Hey there, Slugger. I'd like to ask you a question. What video game comes to mind when I say the words Gothic RPG? If you're a fan of Gothic architecture, Bloodborne's many buttresses might come to mind. Perhaps it'll be Vampire the Masquerade, with Goth subculture its primary influence. Maybe you'll think of the RPG, Gothic. I probably don't need to explain that one.
I am Bromo, this is my house, and these are my girls. I like my girls.
Whatever comes to mind, it's unlikely to be Koudelka. And if it is, there's a good chance it's because you're watching a video with the word Koudelka in the title, so that doesn't really count. Koudelka developer Saknoth has long since been dissolved, but as the years have gone by, the game has garnered some posthumous attention. This is partly thanks to its association with Shadow Hearts, a soft sequel to Koudelka, and judging by the requests I get for this channel, the game you're more likely to have heard of. In this video, I'm going to examine these two games, where each succeeds or fails, how they stack up in context with one another, and what makes them worthy of a second look. To understand the story of Koudelka, it's helpful to understand the background of its development studio. Saknoth was founded in 1997 by Hiroki Kikuta. Having worked for Square as a composer on the Seiken Densetsu or Mana series, Kikuta's ambitions grew beyond writing music for his employer. Due to the hierarchical and bureaucratic nature of Square, he was unable to branch outside of his position. After speaking to the chairman of SNK, Kikuta would secure development funding and, joined by some fellow ex-Square employees, established Saknoth. Immediately following the founding of the company, the developer worked to realize Kikuta's vision for Koudelka. Inspired by early 20th century horror fiction authors such as H.P. Lovecraft and William Hope Hodgson, Koudelka would be an unusual blend of horror and RPG. While such elements had been successfully integrated in games like Parasite Eve and Sweet Home, Koudelka's historical setting of 19th century Wales stood out as unique among other Japanese RPGs. Kikuta would take the internal consistency of his world very seriously. Months were spent reading and researching, including a trip with Saknoth's staff to Wales. Despite Koudelka representing the ultimate opportunity for Kikuta, development was not going according to plan. The reason he had left Square was to exercise his own creativity, to step outside the rigid boundaries they had established for their games. With that in mind, Koudelka's design was becoming more conservative than that which Kikuta had imagined. Saknoth's ex-Square employees were reluctant to forfeit the safe RPG design they'd been relying on for so long.
Unfortunately, though I conceived a grand scheme to realize an innovative game system and visual expression, many of the old staff from Square were not able to accept real change without hesitation. I say that a person who can't accept change is already dead.
Despite competing visions, Koudelka was finished and released in December of 1999 in Japan, June of 2000 in North America, and September of that same year for PAL regions. Koudelka's release didn't receive much by way of fanfare, and it's not hard to see why. Its release window was crowded with worthy RPG contenders. Chrono Cross, Final Fantasy IX, and Vagrant Story would compete for consumer attention, all developed by Square, incidentally. With stiff competition, average reviews, and the release of the PS2 less than a year away, Koudelka's fate as a cult game was sealed. Following the release of the game, Kikuta resigned as Saknoth's CEO and pursued other interests.
After termination of the Koudelka project, I retired as CEO of Saknoth. It was my choice. I was involved with all the integral parts of Koudelka except for the battle and game systems. Especially, I had no influence in the battle system. I still have great regret. I wish I could have designed it.
The question remains, why has Koudelka's legacy only grown since its initial release? Before even reaching the title menu, we're treated to a scene of a woman riding her horse through the countryside, accompanied by a vocal track. This scene, along with the subsequent intro to the game, act as Koudelka's mission statement. These scenes are quiet, contemplative, beautiful but haunting. The year is 1898. The woman is named Koudelka, and she's arrived at a seemingly abandoned monastery for reasons we don't know. Go ahead and take in the view, because the entire game will take place right here. The historical period and choice of setting are pretty unconventional, but then a lot of this game is unconventional. Koudelka meets a dashing and roguish gentleman by the name of Edward Plunkett, and we're given no time to relax before being given an introduction to the game's more supernatural elements. Koudelka and Edward join forces before eventually meeting a priest named James O'Flaherty. Edward Plunkett and James O'Flaherty. What is this, a supernatural RPG or a church picnic volunteer list? These three characters each have their own reasons for being here at Nemeton Monastery, and as the story goes on, they'll uncover the secrets of the Abbey as well as each other. From the moment you're given control, there's an obvious comparison here to Resident Evil. I've heard some people go so far as to call Koudelka a survival horror game, but this really isn't accurate. Despite the fixed angle and general look of the game, Koudelka is an RPG, with random battles, experience points, and a tactical turn-based battle system. The game is certainly flavored with horror and uses these themes to create tension, but any desperate, resource-strapped situations that may occur are purely incidental. Now make no mistake, the presentation is obviously influenced by Resident Evil and Silent Hill. For example, when you add an item to your inventory, you'll move to a separate item pickup screen. Or when you glance at an object or puzzle, you'll often be shown a detailed render of the object in question. Koudelka is also minimalistic in its use of music, relying more on diegetic sound to create an isolated and unsettling atmosphere. Gameplay-wise, though, the similarities to survival horror are minimal. There are no real jump scares, and since you're given control of your character on a grid-based battlefield, the game doesn't really carry the feeling of imminent danger you'd associate with survival horror. Despite the supernatural and RPG elements, Koudelka quickly grounds itself in something less fantastical than your average RPG, and that's mostly thanks to the presentation. This is a very dark game. I mean that visually, although it's also true thematically. The pre-rendered corridors of the Abbey are poorly lit, steeped in grays and browns like old damaged photographs. Even though time is often unkind to pre-rendered backgrounds, particularly in terms of resolution, the absolute sense of foreboding these visuals create holds up damn well. Even understanding the game's rules and knowing that no monsters will ever emerge from the shadows and grab you, I couldn't help but wonder till the very end of the game. What if something's waiting for me in this room? On the topic of monsters, it's in Koudelka's battle environments where the 3D visuals are really given a chance to shine. While the battle screens themselves are typically barren, comprised of a floor material and colored light source depending on the area you're in, the monster designs themselves are really out of this world. Many of them share an uncanny quality you might associate with Lovecraft-inspired fiction, with some really bizarre movement animations. From alien plant life to a biblically accurate angel, there's really nothing off the table here. Compared to the majority of PS1 RPGs, the level of detail on display here is exquisite. Tentacles or extended limbs are segmented into several shapes, giving them the freedom to wriggle independently of each other, and all enemies have their own unique spell casting or death animations as well. As is commonplace in most RPGs of the time, there are a handful of repeats or recolors before the game ends, but that doesn't take away from the sheer variety of enemies. It's one of Koudelka's most impressive aspects, and I was always looking forward to seeing what kind of a wild boss I'd be facing off against next. My favorite presentational aspect of Koudelka, though, is its in-game cutscenes. I can think of a small handful of PS1 games that use motion capture, and among those, Koudelka is probably the only RPG. A decision was made at Saknoth to present Koudelka entirely in English, even for release in non-English speaking countries. I think this was the right decision, though as a native English speaker, I might be biased. This choice resulted in the game's cutscenes not only being fully mocapped, but also fully voice acted as well. Some have ragged on Koudelka's voice acting, but I couldn't disagree more. I think the actors do an excellent job of portraying their characters, better than many modern games in some respects.
Not until I encountered that monster.
Yeah? And we're the ones who took care of that monster. Far be it from me to expect any words of gratitude from you.
I see. And I can tell from your appearances that the power of your faith alone was not enough to smooth things out with that monster.
It wasn't the kind of problem that faith alone could solve.
The flow of conversations sounds so much more natural than the VA I'm used to in these games. Characters will interrupt each other and react without the awkward pauses that usually characterize a video game-y conversation.
I'm confused. So, you really are an angel?
Don't be foolish. Do you really think that there are angels on Earth? I'm no angel. I'm just a medium with a little curing power.
I'm Edward J. Plunkett.
While some games, such as Metal Gear Solid, may be compared to movies, and other verbose RPGs might be compared to books, I couldn't help but shake the feeling while playing Koudelka that I was watching a stage play. Thanks to the motion capture, characters gesticulate while speaking, giving their performances a sense of physicality. You don't usually see this in an RPG where characters often stand still, maybe with a canned animation here and there. The lines are also delivered with an intense focus on emotional highs and lows, as though they're performing for an audience. That being you, watching from your stagehand vantage point.
I am not a priest. I am a bishop.
I don't give a rat's ass what you are.
These cutscenes will go on for minutes at a time with no breaks, no cuts, nobody casually stepping out of the main character's body. The scenes are grounded in something authentic, and you can't help but feel immersed. That's why I felt that the cutscenes themselves were such a nice reward after a period of gameplay. This is especially true once you get to know these characters, who I'll talk about in detail shortly. I'd mentioned that Koudelka has a minimalistic take on music, and I meant it. The entire soundtrack is comprised of a few battle songs and a slew of 30-second long tracks meant to score very specific cutscenes. That means that the number of actual listenable tracks you could throw on your Walkman or whatever the devil it is you kids listen to these days is maybe 5 or 6 tracks at the most. Of course, with such a sparse selection of battle tracks you'll be hearing across the game's 10 to 15 hour runtime, they better be good, right? Oh buddy, let me tell ya, they're good. I'd like to pay special attention to the battle tracks here. The individual shorter tracks are certainly well composed and do a great job of heightening the emotion of the scenes they are used in, but the battle tracks in this game are really something special. The basic battle track, and the one you'll be hearing 1,000 times before the credits roll, is called Waterfall. Before I play it for you, try imagining a horror RPG battling against nightmarish creatures that populate an abandoned monastery. What would you expect that song to sound like? If you hadn't played the game, this is probably not what you were expecting. The song is hypnotic, almost tribal, but upbeat, a little cheerful, but more than anything else, it's melancholic. Like the members of our party are having their lives flash before their very eyes, with all of the joy and regret that comes with those memories. As the song goes on, though, things get more interesting. I wouldn't know how to smoothly transition a song from hypnotic mood piece to Seal of the Pharaoh, but I sure as shit wouldn't have thought to use this horrifying chord. From there, the song delicately loops back on itself. Most battles in this game will end before you even have a chance to reach the Arabic-sounding section of the song, but I find it worth noting that the song has movements. That's not uncommon per se. Dancing Mad, a boss theme in Final Fantasy VI, for example, is made up of different movements. But it's just that, a boss theme, an ode to the big band. Waterfall is a song you'll be hearing a lot, and you know what? It never gets old. It's the best part of battling in Koudelka. It's sad and it's beautiful, and then suddenly it's exotic and mysterious. There's a lot packed into this track, and given how phenomenally his Secret of Mana OST utilizes the SNES sound chip, it's no surprise that Hiroki Kikuta was able to pull off such a rich and atmospheric sound with the PS1. Of course, Waterfall isn't the only battle track in this game. There's also the boss track, Incantation. The percussion in this track is almost identical to Waterfall, and it uses the same instrumentation, give or take some bagpipes. but the vibe here is much darker and more intense, appropriately so. That is until the midway point when the song, much like Waterfall, redirects the mood, this time towards something pensive and nostalgic. It's difficult to explain why it's so good, but these battle tracks just have some lasting quality that makes them enjoyable, even after completing the game, hearing them so many times. And if you think I'm spending a lot of time talking about battle music, well, yeah. The amount of time I spend gushing about it pales in comparison to the amount of time Kikuta spent painstakingly arranging it, and I think it deserves special attention. It's one of the game's more memorable qualities and critical to its atmosphere. As the stakes of the story become heavier, so do the battle tracks become more determined. Our characters are still scared, but confident in their ability to overcome, and there will be much to overcome before the night is over. Koudelka's gameplay can broadly be split into two categories, the first of which is just moving around Nemeton Monastery. Here you'll be exploring the various areas, solving puzzles, and occasionally having your party members engage in conversation. The game is almost entirely linear, although this changes at various points when shortcuts are unlocked. If you're looking to Koudelka for a delightful 60-hour romp through the grasslands of Wales, rife with eccentric characters, side quests, and exploration, go start a barley farm in Llanfair Pwyl Gwyngyl. It'd be an understatement to say that the traditional RPG trappings aren't where Koudelka's strengths lie. There are almost no side quests in the game, and that's even using a pretty charitable definition of side quest. In addition, staying anchored in this dreary monastery for the whole game isn't going to appeal to everyone, which is understandable. The puzzles are fine. As mentioned, there's an obvious comparison to make here with Resident Evil or Silent Hill, but Koudelka's puzzles never quite reach the same level of cleverness. With few exceptions, the solutions to puzzles are found either in their immediate vicinity or in the rooms adjacent to them. There are a few tougher ones here, but don't expect to rack your brain. The only real roadblock is trying to find interactable objects in the environment. Because of the low resolution of the renders, it's difficult to discern what's actually an object and what's just some background detail that got lost in translation. Still, it's hard not to appreciate some of that detail, even if you need binoculars to suss them out on a modern display. Unfortunately, there are more than a few points in the game where events are just described to you rather than shown. If I had to guess, I'd say it's a budgetary limitation, but it ends up crippling the game in some ways. Most notably, it makes you very aware that you'll never encounter an unexpected or shocking event while walking around. I'd mention that being aware of the game's limitations damages the horror a bit. The fact that it persists at all in spite of this is a testament to how moody the environments are. Still, being able to see some kind of horrifying creature on screen would really amplify the fear at some points. Of course, you will encounter horrors beyond human imagination, but they'll be in the form of battles. As mentioned, Kikuta was often at odds with his staff over certain design elements of Koudelka. Most noteworthy of these was the battle system. He had envisioned a real-time combat system in which immersion was never broken by transitionary screens. In addition, he hoped to incorporate adventure game elements, such as being able to interact with the environment to aid with combat and exploration. Kikuta hasn't been shy in regards to his, what I'd go so far as to call, bitterness over his acquiescing to the dev team. Going with random battles must have been a serious deviation from the clear vision he seemed to have for Koudelka. Even disregarding the effect it had on the rest of the game, Koudelka's battle system has always been a matter of contention for fans. After triggering a fight, you'll be sent to a grid-based battle screen. The size of this grid stays the same through the entire game, 5x6 to be exact. Characters take turns in battle depending on their agility, at which point said character can move and/or use an action, attacking, using spells or items. The bones are about what you'd expect for a tactical RPG, but there are a few significant changes that are worth mentioning. You begin the game only controlling Koudelka, who's given a gun by Edward. The gun allows her to attack at range and causes damage independently of her strength stat, which starts out low. In exchange, it must be reloaded periodically, which sacrifices a turn action. Higher quality guns can be found throughout the game, although ammunition for the better ones can be scarce. Edward, on the other hand, starts with a knife, which is pretty straightforward until you start unlocking more melee weapons. You'll realize that weapons in Koudelka actually have durability. They'll eventually break with repeated use. While weapon types such as swords, maces, and dirks are constant until the end of the game, you'll happen across many different elemental varieties. You might find an earth dagger or a light hammer. Elements are nothing to scoff at in Koudelka. They make a huge difference, either positively or negatively. The first boss battle teaches you a very important lesson in that regard. You'll find a water hammer outside of the boss arena. It being the first weapon you'll stumble across, it's probably a massive upgrade over the starting dagger. So you equip it, head into battle, take a swing, and heal the boss. Thankfully, you can switch weapons mid-battle by sacrificing a turn, so finding the right weapon for the occasion is often a matter of experimentation. With weapon durability in mind, you'll often find yourself playing very conservatively with your better weapons, saving them for situations where they'll really come in handy. If this mechanic bothered you while playing, say, Breath of the Wild, it's probably not going to tickle your fancy here either. Weapons break often, so you do have to be careful. Melee weapons also boost or reduce a variety of stats depending on their type. It's not just small bonuses like +1 to speed either. Some weapons can double your health pool, which is pretty great until you get used to it and the weapon breaks and all of a sudden you're twice as vulnerable. The stats affected by weapons can also be influenced on level up. When you gain enough experience, you're given 4 points for stat allocation. You're tacitly encouraged to pursue certain playstyles for each character, but really you could build your party any way you want to. As for the more straightforward stats, strength affects damage output, vitality is health, dexterity affects how often you hit, and agility dictates how many turns you'll get in a round. These aren't small decisions either. 1 point into any of these categories changes things quite a bit. As for the other stats, intelligence affects magic damage, piety affects magic defense, mind affects magic accuracy, and luck affects things like acquiring better weapons and critical hits or something. I don't know. I can't bring myself to put points into luck, I'm sorry. The way magic works is also unconventional in Koudelka. All characters are given the same spells at certain predetermined points in the game. That is unaffected by your stats. It doesn't matter if Edward's intelligence is low. If Koudelka gets a revive spell, Edward gets a revive spell. What is affected by stats are cast speed and spell efficacy. Oftentimes spells will take more than 1 turn to cast, meaning you'll have to plan ahead depending on the situation. The more you cast one spell, the more that spell will level up, and this also goes for weapons. If you repeatedly use swords, eventually that character will gain skill with them, dealing greater damage or sometimes attacking twice in a turn. For these reasons, it's critically important to have your characters individually specialized in different stats. Koudelka gets pretty difficult by the end game, and spreading yourself too thinly between different stats can make things even more so. By the same token, pumping points into only 1 or 2 stats can have unexpected consequences. Piety, for example, increases your magic resistance. Put too many points into it, and the character will actually start resisting healing magic too. I really like that detail. It's a clever way of making in-game mechanics consistent with the world. Overall, the stat building adds a welcome layer of complexity to Koudelka and provides the game with some replay value. The other noteworthy feature regarding battles is how the grid works. Unlike most tactical games, you're not given freedom to move to any space within your distance limit. Rather, you can only move as far ahead on the battlefield as the enemy has on their side. In the beginning of the fight, there's always a rush to the center of the map as you try to increase your maximum movable area. It's prudent to send your tougher characters to the front line as they'll be taking all melee damage. You'll have to manage your character's health while constantly pushing forward when you can, decreasing the enemy's maneuverability and giving your party the advantage. The system works fairly well, but there are a few things that prevent it from reaching its potential. The first thing is the battlefields themselves. They're very bland. At best, I suppose it enhances the feeling of your characters being in a theatrical production, what with the spotlit stage. But that's not necessarily conducive to the gameplay, which is hurting for another layer of strategy. At one point, you'll fight an enemy named Elias. In this fight, and this fight alone, there are obstacles he'll hide behind and use to his advantage, but they're also destructible. It's no surprise that this is one of the most interesting and engaging fights in the entire game. It really goes to show how Koudelka could have benefited from some variety in its battlefields. Having area-specific clutter that would appear semi-randomly on the battle screen would have improved variety. Your strategy for most fights will remain exactly the same, bosses included, after you figure out their elemental weaknesses. That somewhat changes toward the endgame, where enemies become much tougher, but presents a problem for about 80% of the experience. Random battles already have a reputation for being disruptive, and this is intensified when fights are presented in such a methodical and repetitive manner. To put it simply, the game is pretty fucking slow. I'm more patient than most when it comes to these things, and I wasn't necessarily bothered by the constant battles, as Koudelka is mercifully short. That doesn't mean I can't identify the problem, though. You'll spend the vast majority of the game in screens like these, going through the motions, or at worst, running away at risk of becoming underleveled. Since there are no stores or inns here, you'll also have to fight enemies in order to find recovery items or replenish your weapon supply. There are hooks in this combat system that never quite manage to elevate the game. One can't help but wonder what a real-time combat system would have looked like. Could Koudelka have found greater success that way? Or would it have been seen as a cheap Resident Evil clone? It's hard to say, but what I can tell you is that gameplay is not where Koudelka's greatest strengths lie.
I'm confused. So, you really are an angel?
Don't be foolish. Do you really think that there are angels on Earth?
Before we dig into the story, let me introduce you to our main characters one by one. This is Koudelka Yasant. She's a Romani, also known as a gypsy. She's a medium with psychic abilities. She's also very cold, distant, and unpleasant when the game begins, and we really have no indication of why that is.
No, I'm not like you. And this is no place for people like you.
Whatever the case may be, she's immune to the charms of Edward Plunkett, a young man with a silver tongue and a penchant for adventure. It was that spirit of fun and excitement that had him set off for Nemeton Monastery, having heard rumors of its riches.
I heard he brought quite a lot of harlots here. Seems like he was having a great time.
Then there's James O'Flaherty, a Catholic bishop. Part hopelessly naive and part needlessly aggressive, James suspects Koudelka and Edward of being thieves, while keeping the reasons for his own presence here close to his chest.
And I can tell from your appearances that the power of your faith alone was not enough to smooth things out with that monster.
As it becomes clear that there's no immediate escape from Nemeton, the three begin to investigate what happened while quietly pursuing their own ends. Your first impression of these characters will likely be negative, perhaps with the exception of Edward, who may finesse his way into your good graces. It won't take long for that to change, as Edward is revealed to be an impatient, indignant, and outright murderous individual.
You don't want to talk? Fine. I'll slit your holy throat and leave your body for the rats.
Edward?
The three have a dynamic that couldn't be less cogent with conventional RPG writing. They don't like each other, they don't trust each other, and they find each other's beliefs, or lack thereof, despicable. And I relish every minute they're on screen generating static. From the moment they reluctantly joined forces, I just couldn't wait for it all to come to a head. Before we encounter James, Koudelka and Edward find the monastery caretakers. They're invited to enjoy dinner, a meal which Koudelka
No.
politely passes on. Whatever suspicions she may have had are proven right, as Edward is poisoned. In any situation, there's a venomous but shrewd quality in Koudelka's voice, as though distrust is her default state, and she simply can't believe that others don't feel the same way.
I said, if the soup weren't poisoned, then I would have had some.
She makes Edward a deal. As long as he promises to not let his anger get the better of him, she'll heal him of his poison. With this scene, she's proven herself an accurate judge of character. With the caretakers, who she correctly assesses as malevolent, and Edward, who she correctly assesses as an impulsive hothead. She's also someone who's willing to help others despite what she sees as their own shortcomings, however reservedly. Immediately you realize that unpleasantness she displayed in the opening may have further context. Koudelka feels the pain of others intensely, her medium powers acting as more of a curse than a blessing. I realized that perhaps I was too quick to judge, that Koudelka is the way she is for a reason, and in a broader sense, sometimes it's worth giving people with shitty attitudes the benefit of the doubt. That sort of flies out the window when we meet James. James is an asshole, almost cartoonishly so.
I find it inappropriate for you to try to dupe an upstanding believer of the Christian faith.
He's a man of the cloth and has little patience for those who aren't, believing the caretakers to be upstanding people while disparaging Koudelka and Edward as vagrants. This shows James to be a poor judge of character, least of all towards himself, who he sees as an exceptional individual. The religious mismatch, a fundamental difference in worldview, immediately creates a rift between James and the others, and perhaps the player as well. Still, as James and Edward continually argue over poetry and literature, you can't help but notice the two gaining some begrudging respect for one another.
And I thought all outlaws read just simple, stupid poets. You read Shakespeare, you're smarter than you look.
That makes two of us.
A self-righteous dogmatist and a reckless underachiever, each in disbelief that the other would care about art. While James appears almost irredeemable in his attitude towards others, there's no question as to his intelligence, at least when it comes to books. In more worldly matters, James is naive. He thinks the best of others so long as they fit into his narrow worldview and doesn't seem to grasp the situation they're in. This is subtly shown in one scene where an assassin shoots at the party from a window. Koudelka and Edward immediately recognize the threat and duck for cover, while James fails to react for a second before foolishly sticking his head out the window to see the assailant. This is one instance where being a filthy vagrant familiar with the corrupt ways of the secular world comes in handy. Finally, there's Edward. In some ways, it's easier to get a grip on Edward's character because he's such an open book, but there's still a lot to unpack as the story moves along. Edward is subject to some pretty intense highs and lows, quickly changing his disposition and sometimes acting irrationally as a result. Sometimes he'll appear a compassionate individual, especially when it benefits him during an argument.
Look, I'm not saying that all of those people were saints, okay? But that doesn't mean that they should be put to death.
You saw that old couple. They're so well-mannered, kind.
Other times he seems to have less regard for human life than either Koudelka or James, such as when he executes the thief Elias without a second thought.
What did you do that for?
If our lives cease being threatened, then it's a victory for God and all his glory, right?
Koudelka and James have fully developed their worldviews. They understand their own sense of morality. Edward, on the other hand, doesn't seem to have given it much thought.
What about you, Edward? You seem a little more educated than she.
I don't really care. Talk to me about monetary value. Save the holy crap.
It seems I'm disappointed once again.
These questions don't concern him. He only reacts to situations in a way that feels right in the moment. If nothing else, this puts him at constant odds with James, who finds his impulsivity to be detestable, and his intellect to be sometimes surprising. As the three travel through Nemeton, they come across the troubled ghost of a little girl named Charlotte. Nemeton, as it turns out, has been many things over the years, only recently a monastery. Once, it was a prison run by inquisitors who killed Charlotte after her mother supposedly handed her over as an evil child. James, surprisingly, tries to take the compassionate approach.
I don't know what your circumstances are, but I know that your mother loved you very, very much.
But it doesn't work.
I don't know her face, her name, where she came from, nothing.
Nemeton is steeped in evil, filled with the wrathful souls of Inquisition prisoners and experiment subjects. Koudelka, who was drawn to Nemeton for reasons she doesn't understand, feels compelled to help Charlotte avoid an eternity of pain. The party set aside their differences and find a solution. Unopened letters from Charlotte's mother, definitive proof that she too was a victim who never stopped loving her daughter. Charlotte, who'd never known love, is terrified by the notion of being loved. Against her will, the hate that anchored her to this world is transformed, and with that, her spirit rests, while Koudelka's pain persists. It was only because she saw so much of herself in Charlotte that she felt the need to help. Both were cast aside by their mothers, marked as heretical, and seen as unworthy by the world around them. In the end, though, Charlotte was loved by her mother. Koudelka wasn't, but her life goes on, bearing that pain.
Charlotte, how does it feel to know you are loved?
We are also given some insight into James' backstory here. He's been tracking down the Emigre manuscript, a document stolen from the Vatican which contains the occult secrets of bringing the dead back to life. The one who stole it and the owner of Nemeton is Patrick Hayworth, a former friend and associate of James. Their common link was a woman named Elaine Spencer. James and Elaine were in love, but due to his social class, he ultimately felt unworthy of her, unable to provide for her, and pursued the life of a priest instead. He spent his life regretting this choice. Instead of James, Elaine would marry Patrick, but later was tragically murdered by thieves. Patrick spent his life studying the secrets of alchemy, hoping to one day bring Elaine back from the dead. Elaine's spirit has called the medium Koudelka to Nemetin. It's only happenstance that James is here as well. She begs James to destroy the twisted physical form that Patrick has brought back so that her spirit may rest.
Please do not be sad. Death is at the heart of God's reasoning.
What am I left with? I have no meaning in my life. Damn it! What have I been doing with my life?
This contextualizes some of James' discriminatory behavior.
Where you from, Hamburg? Not that it really matters. You're obviously a dirty immigrant thief. Probably infected with cholera or something, most of you are.
He despises the poor, the lower class, the immigrant, because he is all of those things, and he hates himself more than anyone.
But love does not conquer all. I soon discovered that I lack the social status and inheritance money necessary to properly care for someone so well-bred and sheltered as Elaine.
He fancies himself an intellectual, an art critic, a man of the upper class, because those are the things he needed to be but couldn't in order to stay with Elaine. This mission started as a way to advance his station within the church, but now it's a mission to accept the things he cannot change. I'd like to say Koudelka is the best game in which a character named James has self-hatred manifest in undesirable ways, but there's some pretty stiff competition there. Edward, on the other hand, had a somewhat inverse upbringing to James. Edward was given every opportunity to succeed, but much to his father's chagrin, spent his time daydreaming and inventing stories rather than applying himself in school. In an age when every man should understand his life path by adulthood, Edward is no closer to understanding himself at age 20 than when he was a child. So he runs away, unsure of what he'll do or where he'll go. Edward invokes the poet Lord Byron more than once throughout the story.
Where all have gone, and all must go, to be the nothing that I was. I am born to life and living woe.
Lord Byron was a romantic poet who spent much of his life traveling abroad, learning about different cultures and sometimes avoiding creditors. He would write epics such as Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, a poem in which the protagonist, Harold, is disillusioned with his privileged life. He decides to seek meaning through travel, experience, and introspection. He's cynical and disillusioned with the world, but there's still passion inside of him. It seems that Edward fancies himself the Byronic hero, a dark and complex individual who can't find his place in society.
I want no part of a lukewarm existence filled with regret. No. My way is to not worry about consequences, and to do whatever it is I want to do. Chance means nothing to me. Life's a gamble, and once you place your bet, you'd better play to win, or else you end up dead.
This may be true, but it might also be true that Edward is the subject of main character syndrome. This might be why he envies Koudelka's psychic powers. To her, they've been nothing but a curse, but Edward sees them as tantalizing, an exceptional ability for an exceptional individual. While he and Koudelka drink by the fireside, he expresses this, and she does not take kindly to this point of view.
Do you have any idea how much pain my psychic powers have brought me? My father died when I was only a child. I predicted the exact time, place, and ending of my father's life. Imagine that, predicting your own father's death. But you see, even someone like me can do good. Because with my powers, I can help ease the pain of others. That's when I feel good about living. I don't need to be loved. I just want my life to have some meaning. And just want someone to tell me they need me. You. No way will you ever understand.
I'm going back to 3DO games. I still cried while playing them, but for very different reasons. Koudelka brings Edward back to Earth from his flights of fancy, and he's left speechless. For Edward and James, that's what this story is all about, grounding them in reality. Edward ran away from home for the sake of adventure. James came to Nemeton for the sake of his job. Both are receiving something much deeper and more painful than they bargained for, but also something necessary. For James, it's closure. For Edward, perspective. And Koudelka is getting exactly what she's always wanted, meaning. With painful power comes painful responsibility, and she seizes those responsibilities for no other reason than she feels she has to. The party set aside their differences, which seemed so significant back when the game started. Now they appear almost superficial as they understand each other's pain. Any game that could introduce a character like James and have him become sympathetic within 10 hours of playtime deserves some commendation. Now, in between these heavy scenes, there is some levity in the form of Roger Bacon. If you're a history buff, you may have heard this name before. If you haven't, Roger Bacon was a very peculiar figure in 13th century England. He was a Catholic philosopher and a real Renaissance man, so to speak. He was an expert on grammar, mathematics, and logic, an early advocate for the scientific method. Most interestingly, though, he was heavily invested in alchemy. Others saw him as a wizard. He had purportedly created a device called the Brazen Head, an automaton that answered user questions.
Brazen Head, I demand to know, what are the secrets of everlasting life?
Friday, good none. John Madden.
He believed alchemy could be used to prolong human life, such as through the use of a philosopher's stone. Suffice to say, he developed quite a reputation, and it's only fair that Koudelka portrays him as an insane old man who's been alive for 700 years.
Hey, I've been around for 20 years, and I have yet to run across an old man as abnormal as yourself.
I see. Well, I've been around for 600 years, and I've seen plenty of abnormal people just like myself.
You know, props to the voice actor. He's given it everything he's got. I also love that you can hear bones snapping every time he moves around.
What type of a joke is this?
That's my question.
Well, this is no joke. I am the reputable Roger Bacon.
Roger Bacon will periodically arrive to give the party some cryptic advice or lend a hand. His presence is mostly played for comedy, but it does add an enjoyable element to the story. You can't really tell if he's actually gone mad or if he's just privy to such arcane knowledge that our pathetic mortal minds can't keep up with him. He advises the party to burn down the monastery, including the remains of its builder, which causes the spirits within to react violently. Here's where things get really wild. There's one point in the game where you have to pick up a particular item. It's obvious enough that you'll probably see it, but I wouldn't say it's a guarantee. If you didn't pick it up, the game ends here. Elaine's reanimated body just melts everyone's faces off. That is gruesome, and a pretty sorry end to the journey. Hope you were paying attention along the way. Now, aside from the real bad ending, you'll have two potential outcomes for the story. The first of which, referred to as the good ending, only occurs if you manage to beat the final boss, Elaine's faux body. Let me tell you, this is no joke. You have to borderline exploit the game's rules in order to make this work. In this ending, Elaine is defeated, and I'm sorry to spoil the moment, but this TIE fighter scream she makes while falling is unintentionally hilarious. With the night over at last, the party sit in the monastery ruins and reflect.
Memories. Somebody told me that after a loved one's death, all we have is memories. In these, we maintain an eternal bond with the dead.
The so-called bad ending occurs when you lose to the boss. James sacrifices himself to join Elaine in the afterlife. Koudelka and Edward, presumably after a night of getting it on, go their separate ways, knowing they'll never see each other again. Koudelka reveals her Romani nickname.
Hey, your nickname. Slato? What does it mean? I haven't even asked you yet. Will you tell me?
It means treasure.
Well, Edward sees himself as a seeker of treasure, so all's well that ends well, I suppose. If you ask me, the bad ending is the best ending. No, I mean the less bad one. James, who's spent his life in regret, is given a chance to embody the greatest virtue of his faith, sacrifice.
I am what I am. I am content with my lot. I have always loved you, Elaine.
In doing so, he finds redemption and peace. There's a long-standing debate in the church regarding faith versus works. Do good deeds hold as much weight as one's own intrinsic goodness? Can an evil nature be counterbalanced through charity and acts of kindness? As eager as I am to dive into this one head first, and that is sarcasm, suffice to say, James was a man who, for the most part, exercised his faith with works alone.
If these treasures can be contributed to the Vatican, their value to Christianity is unquantifiable.
He was a perfectionist and saw faith as quantifiable. At the start of the game, you can just hear the superiority in his admonitions. He's a friar, he reports to the big guy himself. Everything he says and believes must be inherently good. I'm sure Patrick Hayworth thought the same thing when he took the role of God into his own hands. After meeting Elaine, something changes in James. He's different. Once he made demands of others.
Will you shut up and get us out of here? How hard can it be for thieves like you to get us out of a place like this?
Now, a selflessness shines through.
I have no intention of asking for your sympathy, and I'm in no position to plead for your help. So from this point forward, I can manage on my own.
If the unexamined life is not one worth living, then perhaps this forced reflection was for the best. Edward hits the road with no particular destination in mind. The ending of Childe Harold's pilgrimage has Harold reflecting on his lost innocence. He's seen shocking things and had difficult experiences, but he's found his soul in the process. We don't know exactly what becomes of Edward, but I'd like to think that some of his wild oats are sown, that impulsivity and arrogance melted down and refined into maturity. These are just my thoughts on it, as his fate is left ambiguous. What we can say for sure is that Edward arrived at Nemeton for fun and adventure. As the night went on, he had every opportunity to leave, but he didn't. That alone indicates selflessness. As for Koudelka, well, as she's lamented, there's no choice but to go on living. Roger Bacon asks her,
Is it okay, child, for you not to follow him?
Yeah, it's okay.
Koudelka is at peace with her decision to part ways. She's confident that one day they'll cross paths again, and it's always been a lonely existence for her anyway. Earlier, she said something to Edward.
Even someone like me can do good.
Even someone like me can do some good. This is true of Koudelka, but also Edward and James, who both arrived at Nemeton for selfish reasons. In the end, whatever lives they lived or intentions they had, it wasn't too late to find their way. Koudelka never had a choice in the matter, though. She came to the monastery without hesitation because she was called there by Elaine, and if it were up to her, she'd spend the rest of her life doing the same. She carries pain, scorn, sorrow. Easing this in others is the only power she has in this life, even when she can't do the same for herself. Koudelka, the game, not the character, is a grower, not a shower. I can understand why the game was given mediocre reviews while simultaneously becoming a beloved forgotten gem. The forgotten aspect has changed somewhat over the past few years, as the internet brings light to old games and tastes change over the years. Back in 2000, around the golden age of JRPGs, with the next generation of consoles looming on the horizon, Koudelka just didn't have the moxie to take on Square's giants. But circumstances have changed. Not only is there room for strange, short, and experimental RPGs, but a hunger for them. Indie developers spent years chasing after this aesthetic, trying to bring their own twist to the classic formula. To find an authentic product of its time, bold enough to go against the grain, well, it was only a matter of time before Koudelka was given a second look. It's not a game I'd wholeheartedly recommend to anybody. The gameplay is lacking in many ways, and the creative flourishes used to separate it from its brethren don't necessarily make it enjoyable. Weapon durability is a contentious mechanic in most cases, and that's certainly true here, where it impedes an already slow-moving battle system. The game is just slow in general, slower than most. Clocking in at just over 10 hours, it's a quick game, but it takes its sweet-ass time getting you from point A to point B. The stakes of the story might not seem particularly high on paper. Pair that with a historical 1800s setting in a game that frequently stops you to let cutscenes play out, you've got something very grounded. Some would call it boring. I mean, how can you compare Koudelka to the vibrant tropical fantasy of Chrono Cross, or the epic metaphysical quest that is Xenogears? Well, you can't really, and you shouldn't, because Koudelka's ambitions are tempered. The game is a character study, and in that way, it succeeds. Every time I wanted to include some goofball nonsense in this section of the script, I just couldn't bring myself to diminish the sincerity that drips from these characters' dialogue. A lot of it hit me very close to home, and I think most grown adults who play Koudelka are likely to identify with at least one of its characters. For those characters to convey this complexity in such a brief game and such a limited presentational format is amazing. It may not have been the smashing success that Saknoth was hoping for, but it remains a worthwhile piece of PlayStation history. If you're patient, and if you're willing to extend some empathy to video game characters, then I'd recommend playing Koudelka, even if this video spoiled it for you. I believe it has the power to make a lasting impression, and that makes it an experience worth having. While Koudelka was a team effort, it clearly was Kikuta's baby. Relinquishing control and releasing what most critics considered a middling product may have been the reason for his departure from Saknoth. He's worked on games now and again over the years, but his investment in the industry clearly took a dive after Koudelka's release. According to him, there were no plans for a sequel, and if he'd stayed at Saknoth, that probably would have remained the case. Matsuzo Machida, who was Koudelka's art director, was given greater responsibility as writer and director of the studio's next project. It would be known as Shadow Hearts, and it would expand on the world of Koudelka while also acting as a viable entry point. This seems like a great idea from my perspective. Though Koudelka ended on a satisfying note, this world in which the Second Industrial Revolution meets the paranormal is rife with potential. Nominally separating the game from Koudelka also gave Saknoth the opportunity for a fresh start. The game would be developed for the PlayStation 2, which, with its staggered launch, would be starved for traditional RPGs by 2001. Between then and 2002, Shadow Hearts was released in all territories. The game reviewed decently well, and sales matched that moderate critical reception. Despite closely competing with Final Fantasy X for consumer attention, Shadow Hearts found a small but devoted audience, not dissimilar from that of its predecessor. Yet in many ways it almost couldn't be more different from Koudelka. I'm going to take a look at Shadow Hearts, and here's my solemn promise to you, okay? Someday I'll examine Shadow Hearts Covenant. That game will likely get its own video. For now, let's take a look at Saknoth's sophomore effort, where it succeeds, where it fails, and how it compares to Koudelka. The first thing I thought when booting up Shadow Hearts was, oh wow, that music.
Whoa, down!
The second thing I thought when booting up Shadow Hearts was, oh no, that voice acting.
Major Tsuji, what is this about? Why the special train in the middle of the night to escort this girl to Japan?
Oh baby, that voice acting. The game opens up with a brief overview of the world we're in. It's now 1913, 15 years after the events of Koudelka. A priest has been murdered, and while this occurred in France, Shadow Hearts is actually set in China, at least for now. The daughter of the priest is being taken by the Japanese government on a train when a mysterious, magical, top-hatted man arrives to take her away. He introduces himself as,
Yes, Roger Bacon. I'm honored that you remember me so well.
Which I spent my entire playthrough agonizing over. This is Roger Bacon. What the hell happened?
This is no joke. I am the reputable Roger Bacon.
Before he can kidnap the woman named Alice, he's stopped by a real cool dude. This is Yuri. He's our main character. While he fails to kill Roger Bacon, he manages to abscond from the train with Alice, and that's our introduction to Shadow Hearts. Now, the majority of people who played Shadow Hearts at release likely didn't realize it was a sequel to Koudelka. Bear in mind that Koudelka's success was quite limited, and the internet was a very different place. To an extent, this disassociation was probably by design. It works in the game's favor because it's immediately so different from its predecessor. The characters are bombastic, the horror is played for shock, and the battles are more traditionally turn-based affairs. You'll quickly find that character interaction also adheres much more to RPG convention at the time. Rather than being fully voice acted and motion captured, dialogue is almost entirely text-based, with only a few canned animations being used to provide that visual element. Given the VA in the intro, this might be for the best. Regardless, you gotta love this dialogue font. DF Foon, otherwise known as the Dark Cloud, Harvest Moon, and Tales of Symphonia font. Character portraits are used to clarify things a bit, but unfortunately you don't get the range of emotion a la Xenogears. What Shadow Hearts does share with Koudelka is its perspective. The game uses pre-rendered backgrounds and fixed camera angles. It was often docked points from critics who lamented its lack of real-time 3D environments. Ironically, I think this is actually one of Shadow Hearts' greatest presentational assets. PS2 RPGs that use pre-rendered backgrounds are few and far between. It's always nice to see what advantages are afforded by the PS2's superior hardware. After escaping from Roger Bacon, Yuri, known at this point as Rude Hero, attempts to make his introduction to Alice, Girl in Danger. This largely involves her running away and him pursuing her while implying he wants to do things that, if mentioned, will demonetize this video with extreme prejudice. Basically, he comes across as a gigantic asshole. In terms of both writing and artistic design, my first impression of Shadow Hearts is that it's reminiscent of manga and anime of the time. It's dark, morally ambiguous, with a protagonist who pursues their own end without regard for social norms. Which is interesting, because I'd actually describe Koudelka in much the same way, but with a totally different connotation. I guess the most valid distinction I could make is this. Shadow Hearts is the kind of game where the main character says, "I'm changing from your ordinary bad boy type into a real psycho." In all seriousness, the dark aspects are given more weight in Koudelka. They are played straight for the sake of painting a picture of the characters and the world they're in, connecting that to the player. Shadow Hearts will have some weighty character development, but it has much more fun with the darker elements. It's not afraid to be edgy, and as much as we all pretend otherwise, edgy can be pretty entertaining. I know you still have that follow the leader poster in your bedroom. Edgy has taken on a purely negative overtone over the years, sort of a substitute for cringeworthy. The act of being edgy just means to push boundaries. In doing so though, you are often on the knife edge of being cringe. There are fine lines between something being cool, something making a valid point, and something being so tone-deaf or ridiculous in its excess that you can't help but laugh at it. What may have been considered shocking or badass in 2001 might be seen as child's play now. That's why where once his actions commanded my respect, my brother is now cringe for having made a wallet lanyard out of industrial chain link, undoubtedly well under the inspiration of Fear Factory's album Demanufacture. My point is just that some aspects of Shadow Hearts' writing aren't exactly timeless, but that doesn't stop them from being enjoyable in a different way. Koudelka was written to be timeless. Shadow Hearts was written to ride the cultural zeitgeist of its time. What Koudelka and Yuri share are the ambiguity of their motivations. Yuri hears voices in his head driving him to travel around and do certain tasks without really understanding why he's doing them. In this case, he was told to rescue Alice from the train in northern China. While fleeing, they find themselves in Zhaoyang village. Immediately there's an unsettling vibe, as nothing about this place seems quite right. You find out that the humans inhabiting this village are cannibals. Then you find out that they're actually demons. Then the village turns into a fleshy hellscape with your footsteps making squelching noises. It's not just a suggestion of horror, it's out-and-out horror, and this oppressive atmosphere is one of Shadow Hearts' greatest strengths. But it's not a constant. The way Shadow Hearts is structured is almost like a horror anthology. You'll find yourselves in a new area, sometimes it's immediately clear something is wrong, other times not so much, and then you have to overcome whatever nightmares are in store for you. Following that, the tension is diffused. There's a blend of Japanese and Chinese mythology here, while also retaining the Lovecraftian influence from the original game. The cosmic element of horror builds in intensity as the game goes on, but there's often something sinister happening underneath the surface of these seemingly pleasant Chinese villages. There are a lot of moving parts making up the whole of Shadow Hearts' setting. There's the historical angle, which takes on a much more prominent role than Koudelka. The game takes place 1 year before the First World War. Japan is attempting to expand its sphere of influence into mainland China, leading to a period of conflict and mistrust. This means for much of the game's first half, you'll be exploring the real-world areas such as Shenyang, Kowloon, and Shanghai. These areas often have different allegiances but are bonded by a shared conflict with the supernatural. All of these horrific elements aren't exactly commonplace, but they're largely accepted in Shadow Hearts' world. In one of the few instances where Shadow Hearts will use voice acting, you'll be told a ghost story from an old woman. It is profoundly uncomfortable. As you travel throughout China, you'll learn more about Yuri and Alice. Yuri is a harmonixer, someone who, through a process called fusion, is able to shapeshift into supernatural creatures. He's pursued relentlessly by demons both inner and physical, often going unconscious and facing off against a mysterious assailant called Foxface. Alice, on the other hand, is an exorcist. She hears voices like Yuri does, but they don't torment her so much as they aid with her abilities. In addition to Yuri and Alice, you'll have a few other recruitable party members. The first of these is Zhu Zhenlu, a grumpy old man trained in the art of yin and yang magic. You'll also meet Marguerite, a spy working against the Japanese government. These characters are introduced in wholly different contexts, and the conflict rapidly becomes complicated. China and Japan are battling with one another, the Japanese military wants to seize Alice along with a warlock named De Wei, and you just kinda need to roll with it. The beginning of the game is slow moving as all the pieces are set up. There's a lot of dialogue to move through. Without all the energy that voice acting or character animation brings to the table, I found the first 5 or so hours of Shadow Hearts to be quite boring. There are moments that draw you in, such as these scenes of horror where the environment transforms, but the scenes are often undercut by the appearance of some new character or story beat that only distracts from the task at hand. As for the characters, Zhu Zhen grabbed me immediately. Wizened old man with magical powers who's tired of everyone's bullshit? It's like this character was made for me. This is my character. He and Yuri exhibit many of the same traits, such as their stubbornness, which causes them to butt heads more than once. It's entertaining at the very least. Zhu Zhen also has a connection to Yuri, having associated with his now deceased father, a mysterious man who was absent for the majority of Yuri's life. Having him tag along with the party makes perfect sense. The information that'll be drip-fed to Yuri in regard to his past gives him motivation to keep Zhu Zhen around. Unfortunately, outside of this, his character development is limited. This problem is present in more cases than I'd like here, but more on that later. Marguerite actually shares many of Zhu Zhen's traits too, namely the propensity to make smart-ass remarks. She's much more secretive, but appears to be trustworthy. She fancies herself a femme fatale, but she's just incompetent enough to make her a relatable addition to the party. Now, her motivation to join through thick and thin is a bit questionable. She's drawn in by Yuri and Alice's powers and wants to document them, believing such information may be of benefit to her employer. This is fine justification up until she has to fight literal physical incarnations of evil. You'd probably want to cash your check and head home at that point. At any rate, she'll come to understand the gravity of the situation over the course of the story. The first of 2 primary conflicts you'll be paying attention to in Shadow Hearts is the conflict within Yuri. From what we understand about him, his only calling in this world is to battle the supernatural. As he fights, he accumulates negative energy in the form of malice, and it's here where he's mocked relentlessly by the 4 Masks and Foxface. These are all incarnations of his negative energy. In addition to being a major thread of the plot, this is used as an element of gameplay as well. Anytime you find yourself at a save point, you can transport Yuri to the graveyard. This is a manifestation of Yuri's soul, represented as the resting place of the beasts he's killed in his travels. As an aside, this graveyard is such an atmospheric scene, definitely emblematic of Shadow Hearts for me. The music that plays here, along with the desolate visual design, really sells an almost classic 1930s universal horror feeling. The fog pouring across the screen and the twisted dead trees in the background, you can almost hear Vincent Price narrating Yuri's life from here.
There'll be food and drink and ghosts.
As you battle monsters, your malice level will increase, indicated by this jewel in the menu, which is blue when you're in the clear and red when your malice is at critical levels. When it's too high, you'll be visited by any of the 4 masks or Foxface depending on where you are in the story, so you'll have to periodically return here to battle a monster to clear that malice. Once again, we find ourselves with random battles. Shadow Hearts has a much more traditional take on turn-based RPG combat, offering a few twists rather than an entirely unique system. On each character's turn, no matter what command you execute, your success depends on something called the Judgment Ring. This emblem appears on each action you take and requires you to press the action button in rhythm with the highlighted portion of the ring in order to succeed. For a regular attack, you might have 3 highlighted portions. For each successful press, the ring will continue, and you can power up your attack to a maximum of 3 levels. Only time 1 hit correctly and the Judgment Ring will cancel out, with your attack at a minimum power level. The system gets more complicated depending on what action you're taking too. Certain spells or abilities will have very narrow margins of success. In almost all cases, there's also a razor-thin slice of the ring which will cause attacks to be powered up significantly. That small addition really does wonders for this system, as you'll constantly be gauging whether it's worth pushing for those extra damage numbers, at risk of missing an attack altogether. It's not just the battle screen where you'll see the Judgment Ring either. This thing is everywhere. Turning a crank? Judgment Ring. Trying to get a discount at a store? Judgment Ring. Opening a door? Judgment Ring. I don't even understand that one. Is Yuri just failing to remember how door opening works? I can't rightly say it improves every facet of the gameplay experience, but I think it's a worthwhile addition in combat. There, it really helps Shadow Hearts stand out in a sea of similar games. My problem with it is a problem that I never really felt impeded the gameplay experience of anything I played until I made this YouTube channel. I'm colorblind, and I can't fucking see the thing against the background sometimes. It's literally invisible. I just have to fly by instruments here and hope for the best. I'll try not to hold it against the developers. Even when ignoring my problems, there are times where I feel like they overdid it just a little. Periodically, you'll find these guild cards that net you a discount at stores. The caveat is that you have to successfully pass a full rotation of the Judgment Ring. For each successful rotation, you can choose to accept your current discount or attempt an even harder rotation for a better one. This is an interesting gambit, and I think it's a good addition, but it would have been nice if you were able to group all of the items you wanted to buy together. As it stands, you have to individually attempt each item, and it makes the act of buying supplies and weapons take much longer than it needs to. I know, you can just not do it, and by the end of the game, that's exactly what I did. It just sucks to circumvent a major mechanic altogether strictly because of how it's implemented. Like I said though, it's a good addition overall. The Judgment Ring has become the de facto symbol of Shadow Hearts. It's somewhat similar to Legend of Dragoon's timed button presses for attacks, which in my review for that game, I expressed positivity towards as well. I saw a few comments from people who absolutely hate the addition system in that game, claiming it felt like an ongoing QTE. Well, I think that's a bit reductive, but fair enough, you're under no obligation to like things like this, and if you don't, you are going to be miserable playing Shadow Hearts. The Judgment Ring is meant to be a test of skill and timing to make combat more engaging, but it's just as likely to make combat miserable if you're not a fan of such things. The ring is also displayed at a slant, which makes it even harder to time properly, which is likely by design. The Judgment Ring isn't the only thing that separates Shadow Hearts combat from other systems. There's also Yuri's fusion ability, which adds another layer of complexity over the game. After each battle, you'll earn elemental energy depending on the enemy type you've defeated. Once you reach a minimum threshold in any particular element, you'll find its associated grave in the graveyard glowing with energy. You'll be tossed into a fight with a monster, and upon victory, that monster will be added to Yuri's fusion roster. During battle, you can sacrifice a resource called SP in order to transform into any of the available monsters you have equipped. Transforming in a fight can give you an edge, most notably in the form of elemental strengths and weaknesses. Certain fusion monsters have higher strength or speed as well. Having access to fusions gives you a nice trickle of micro rewards through the game, acting as a sort of in-between level up and providing incentive to not run away from battles. It's cool to see what monsters you'll have available next, and they really turn the tide of some fights, especially in the late game. The only real problem with the fusion system is that it's often impossible to predict what element a boss will represent. With only 3 equipable fusions at once, it's often a matter of luck to end up with the right one at the right time. Limiting equipable fusions to 3 was likely a way to balance difficulty, but seeing as actually figuring out a boss's element can be a puzzle in itself, the limitation mostly feels unnecessary. In addition, bosses will more often than not cause status ailments, some of which are pretty severe. To counteract this, Shadow Hearts has got the longest list of accessories I think I've ever seen in an RPG. You've got stuff to prevent petrification, to make attacks twice as strong but judgment rings half the size, to increase special defense. There's a lot of stuff here. Sooner or later, you'll probably use most of it out of necessity, but like fusions, you don't know what ailments a boss will cause until you're fighting them. Both of these factors make it feel like Shadow Hearts relies somewhat on trial and error. It's not such a problem in the beginning, but as the game goes on, there are some pretty tough bosses. Add poison, silence, and confusion on top of that, and you'll spend more time performing damage control for your own team than attacking the opposing one. I like this in principle. The focus on ailments and elemental counters can be fun, in the Shin Megami Tensei games, for example. Maybe fun's not the right word. I do think it can be somewhat frustrating in Shadow Hearts though, as, like I said, you'll often head into battle with some mismatched gear by no fault of your own. I think this will likely drive a lot of people to use walkthroughs in order to avoid no-win situations. It's never good for players to feel dependent on third-party resources. As for the fusion resource, SP, it's actually something that all characters have. Only Yuri uses it for any pragmatic reason, but all party members start with a full pool of SP that'll gradually drain over the course of the battle. It's meant to represent a character's mental state, sanity points. Once a character's SP reaches 0, they go berserk, which acts much the way confusion does in most RPGs. It's not usually make or break, especially considering there are SP restoring items that can be used to prevent a character from reaching 0. Even so, it's a fun little system that puts some pressure on you to be finished with battles as soon as possible. It would have been nice to see it expanded in some way, as I think there's a lot of room for creativity with a sanity system in an RPG. The other thing worth mentioning here is the voice acting. Sometimes you'll get an English line.
Yeah, I could use some help here.
Sometimes you'll get a Japanese line. There's a huge disparity in the way the voice actors sound, so the battle chatter is amateurish in the funniest way. My headcanon is that he's yelling, "You're an asshole." The combat system is much easier to explain and understand than Koudelka's. It's perhaps less interesting as a result of that, but it's also more intuitive and more appropriate for the game it's in. Shadow Hearts is a much longer game than Koudelka, so being forced to move slowly through these types of fights would have worn on my patience if it were the standard for this game. Despite the stark range in difficulty depending on fusions and accessories, I think Shadow Hearts mostly succeeds where it matters in terms of battles. Namely the Judgment Ring, which engages the player and keeps your eyes from glazing over during a long fight. For much of the first half of the game, the party is in pursuit of this man, Dewey, I'm so sorry for the pronunciation, I'm really trying here, who fraternizes with Roger Fakin. They both see Alice as a key to the Demon's Gate invocation, which is some dark ritual. Yuri finds out that his father, Ben, defeated Dewey 15 years ago, but lost his life as a result. The trauma of this incident, as well as his father's fusion abilities, were Yuri's inheritance. We're given periodic flashbacks to Yuri's final memories of his father, who tills the ground at their family home, standing underneath a large tree at sunset. He laments having to leave his family to perform his secretive work that we now know led to his death. It wouldn't be long before Yuri's mother would die as well. While Zhuzhen fills in the blanks and Yuri recalls memories of his father, the plot takes us all over the damn place. This is one of the most significant differences between Shadow Hearts and Koudelka. The latter takes place in a monastery, while the former is a swashbuckling adventure. We steal airplanes, we're smuggled aboard ships, we work with agents of the Japanese military. There are bombings, there's also ghosts and shit the whole time too though. It's quite an array of themes and settings we've got here. Things get pretty wild about halfway through the game when the Demon's Gate invocation actually succeeds. An entity called the Seraphic Radiance is summoned, and while Dewey is killed, the party can't stop Roger Bacon from fulfilling his plans. Yuri effectively sacrifices himself to fuse with the Seraphic Radiance, having his soul absorbed in the process. However, he fails to prevent the destruction of Shanghai. It's a pretty disturbing scene and frankly kind of unexpected. The game has had dark tones up until this point, but it's been relatively lighthearted. It felt like the adventure was culminating in this moment, but just like that, things don't work out. we're given a time skip and appear in Europe, where the second half of the game takes place. In my opinion, this is where the game actually gets good. I found the first half of Shadow Hearts to be made of so many different elements that never coalesced. It was difficult to become invested. Don't get me wrong, there are flashes of brilliance inside of it all, but the game failed to grip me until this point. When we arrive in Europe, we find the team sans Yuri working as exorcists, trying to find any hint of where Yuri's body might have gone. The flavors of horror you'll find in Shadow Hearts range quite dramatically depending on which half of the game you're in. The first half is based more on Asian horror, with the situations themselves being disturbing and the focus being on mythology and folklore. The second half is more of a traditional Gothic horror, with a clearer inspiration from Lovecraft. For example, the first area you'll visit is Transylvania, where a series of experiments have gone wrong. It's all very reminiscent of the Lovecraft story Herbert West Reanimator. The visual design of this area is top-notch. It just evokes such an uncanny feeling, especially when revisiting the area in memories. The black and white just seals the deal for me. I really like the visual design of the game as a whole. As mentioned, Shadow Hearts uses pre-rendered backgrounds like its predecessor. These backgrounds were quite common in the PS1 days, but with the PS2's processing power, it was increasingly uncommon to see devs utilizing this style. Pre-rendering was originally used as a way of displaying detailed 3D graphics without needing resources to render them. Like British cuisine, it was mostly a product of wartime rationing that ended up sticking around in various forms. Unlike jellied eels, it's only become more appreciated over time. Certain 6th gen games, such as 2002's Resident Evil, are well known as representing the absolute peak of this style. Even Shadow Hearts contemporaries, such as Final Fantasy X, which is known as a real-time 3D game, will occasionally sneak pre-rendered backgrounds in to great effect. Shadow Hearts is displayed almost entirely in this style, and as a result, the game holds up exceptionally well. Most of the time when I'm talking about its atmosphere, the backgrounds are doing a lot of heavy lifting there. There are certain advantages that 6th gen hardware brought to the table, which you can really see on display here. On the technical side of things, the game runs at 60 FPS, which is a nice bonus. Visually, you'll get a great deal of effects on screen, such as fire, light reflection, fog. There's always some movement on screen, which is key to having the player suspend their disbelief. Pre-rendered backgrounds can be quite boring when they're static, and boredom will always make a player more cognizant that they're playing a game. Here, there's always something visually interesting, whether it's activity in the background or some focal point your eyes can circle around on while traversing the screen. However, moth animation? Seriously lacking compared to Koudelka. Talking points for that. Shadow Hearts was criticized by reviewers for looking like a PS1 game on release. This is partially because the 6th generation of consoles represented the complete jump to 3D, and some critics wouldn't accept anything less. There is some truth in this assessment though, as the backgrounds are a bit blurry and the character models are pretty low poly. This is hidden well most of the time, but battles are one of the few instances where everything is displayed in 3D. The backgrounds here don't showcase Shadow Hearts' strengths. Despite some of the limitations, Shadow Hearts is usually an excellent looking game. In particular, the otherworld scenes where the environment changes just send a chill down my spine. Outside of these instances, the game is actually very bright and colorful, a diametric opposition to the almost sepia-toned hallways of Nemeton Monastery. That brightness doesn't prevent certain scenes from conveying a dark or oppressive feeling. One such example being the optional area Kowloon Fortress, which was a crumbling slum at the best of times. And these, my friends, are not the best of times! Considering the globe-trotting ethos of the game, I think it was the right choice to add vibrance to the world, as this pairs well with Shadow Hearts' sense of humor. While the battles aren't as impressive to behold, there are aspects that hold up here too. Koudelka's enemy design often aimed for body horror, but Shadow Hearts takes a more mythological angle. There are demons here, and even some welcome revisits of Koudelka's enemies as well, but some of these opponents are almost whimsical in their design. This one has a dong. That's whimsical. I mention this all now because I believe the game's visual design becomes a bit more cohesive at the European section in the game. Prior to this, there was something of a scattershot approach to each area, with many of them lacking a feeling of connection to each other. Once you reach the halfway point, these areas seem to abide by a more singular vision. You're also introduced to some new characters for your party. While solving the crisis in Bistritz, the company heads over to the Transylvanian castle. Would you believe me if I told you a sexy vampire joined the party? Believe me. This is Keith Valentine. He's a benevolent vampire, wise beyond his years, and with great combat skill. As it turns out, Yuri's soulless body wandered into Keith's castle at some point, where he's been waiting. He was driven to insanity by the Seraphic Radiance, which is a plot point with a distinctly Lovecraftian flavor, a little color out of space. As an aside, I love that every time color out of space is portrayed, it's just like magenta. Ooh, magenta. I'm going crazy. Once the party finds Yuri, what follows is one of the more captivating threads tied up for Shadow Hearts. Alice, whose affection for Yuri has become more and more evident, finds herself in the graveyard, Yuri's subconscious. Something interesting but missable is that examining these gravestones as Yuri will reveal some aspect of himself that he hates. When Alice looks at them, she sees Yuri's virtues that he can't recognize in himself. The masks introduce themselves as fear, envy, anger, and hate, pieces of Yuri that take control when his malice becomes too much. They explain that Yuri is preparing himself for death, where suffering can no longer touch him. In a Faustian bargain, Alice can find Yuri's soul within the graveyard, but she must promise her soul. With that, she'll bear the burden of suffering with him, along with some other yet-to-be-known consequences. Of course, she agrees without hesitation. His memory twisted, Yuri stands underneath the tree from his childhood, a large moon looming overhead. He doesn't till the land in order to plant seeds of life, but digs his own grave to prepare for death. This at the direction of Foxface, a man who resembles his father but with a mask that Yuri wore as a child. He reveals that Yuri is terrified of fusing. He sees each monster as a malicious piece of himself that longs to rebel, but he continues to do it for the sake of others. Foxface seems to be a monster of Yuri's own creation. He's a punishment for Yuri's failure to live up to his father's standards and his inability to save his mother. She died trying to protect him from his own abilities. Whether Yuri hid these memories or repressed them isn't clear. All we know is that Alice is the only one capable of breaking through to Yuri. After a battle against Foxface, Yuri defeats his self-punishment. His memory of the garden changes to match reality, and those aspects of himself that he was so afraid of are integrated. There's a lot to unpack in this scene, and some parallels to Koudelka. First of all, shades of Xenogears, anyone? It seems in a lot of these late 90s, early aughts JRPGs, psychological topics are handled in a clever way for the medium. These topics are given literal, physical manifestations in the game world. In this way, complex and abstract concepts can be easily communicated to the player. Different characters and their actions representing different stages of things like trauma or grief. You kinda just intuitively get what the game is trying to say, even if you're not especially conscious of it. It's a much more direct and arguably ambitious way of tackling a character's inner struggles than Koudelka, communicating subtext through very literal representations. Speaking of Koudelka, I appreciate the various parallels to that game here as well. Like Koudelka's main cast, Yuri is only able to reflect and understand the broken pieces of himself thanks to the presence of others, in this case Alice. She acts not only as a mirror through which he can see what's happening to himself, but also a companion who can help him shoulder that burden. The voices that greatly trouble Yuri are simply accepted parts of Alice. As a matter of fact, she finds them helpful because she doesn't fight them. Only after acknowledging his love for Alice is Yuri able to successfully integrate these voices, understand himself, and find the help he desperately needed to shoulder these burdens. In some sense, this matches Koudelka in the original game, as her loneliness and isolation only breeds more resentment. Like her, Yuri is called forward by forces he doesn't understand. He only knows that he has to listen to them, that doing so will ultimately result in good, even when he's too encumbered by misery to be good himself. Of course, that assessment of himself is not accurate, but Yuri has created a demon of his own to reinforce this lie. Self-flagellation, disguised as both his father and himself as he was prior to misery. An unbreakable cycle, until Alice breaks it. You can see it in his fusion transformations as well. Prior to the scene, Yuri struggles in agony as fusions break out, as though he's desperately trying to control them. Afterwards, he's confident in the transformations, as though he knows he's in the driver's seat. It's a shame that the game doesn't explore these concepts further or spend more time building to this point, because it's one of the most sincere and enjoyable parts of the game. I would go so far as to say that in terms of character growth, it's the only part that stands toe-to-toe with Koudelka's cutscenes. That's a hell of a feat considering not only how limited in presentation Shadow Hearts is, but also because it's a much more plot-focused game than Koudelka. There's a lot happening here, but it's at its best when it slows down and lets us understand a character we already know rather than introducing a slew of new ones. The scene also brings to mind the fact that the remaining cast members aren't really explored in such a meaningful way. We'll get occasional glimpses into their pasts, but even Alice isn't given the care and attention you'd hope for. Keith is a vampire, which makes him nearly immortal and a potential font of fascinating stories in in-game history, but he's given almost no characterization. I can hardly describe his personality, much less his background. This is also true of Marguerite, whose story is initially left mysterious, but as the game goes on, those little nuggets of truth you'd hope for never arrive. She's a party member, nothing more, nothing less. This will change slightly with some characters being expanded upon in Shadow Hearts Covenant, but on its own, Shadow Hearts does a poor job of getting you invested in anyone aside from Yuri, and Alice to a lesser extent. The only other character I really cared about was myself, because, as you can see, they call me out by name here. Of all the video game genres, I'd argue that RPGs are the best vehicle for characterization. The player expects to experience downtime, there's less of a need to rush through an RPG for fear of boring the player. That gives devs ample time to divert your attention, to tie individuals' characters' pasts and personalities into the story. That said, it's always disappointing when a potentially intriguing cast of characters isn't given the limelight. Yuri's backstory shows some sophistication in the game's writing, more than I was expecting to be frank, but that sort of starts and stops with him. Despite the conclusive nature of Yuri's conflict, there's still quite a bit of story left here as well. First, to the city of London, capital of England and father to the United States of America, and host to music that sounds like it belongs in a Kia commercial. This is the worst segue into talking about music I've ever used, but I'm gonna do it. The music in Shadow Hearts is very interesting, but it's interesting in a way completely distinct from that of Koudelka. While Kikuta had grown up with a steady diet of progressive rock, the baton for Shadow Hearts was passed primarily to Yoshitaka Hirota, who spent much of his early career designing sound effects for Square. Hirota had made sound effects for Final Fantasy VI and VII, Chrono Trigger, and Chrono Cross, but had comparatively little experience composing music for games. In the limited realm of SNES sound, he created complex effects by layering and modulating waveforms. This is where we get such iconic sounds as Terra's scream in Final Fantasy VI, and Robo's voice in Chrono Trigger. Hirota had a great many influences for Shadow Hearts. Knowing that the game would be set partially in China, he studied traditional Chinese music. He'd also recently played through the Sega Saturn game Baroque, so its dark ambience was also at the forefront of his mind. As a child, he was fascinated with the low, growling tone of the bass guitar. Combining these with his penchant for finding personality in sound effects, and you have a truly unique soundtrack. One of the battle themes, NDE, is much more traditional, but really showcases Hirota's ability to create something dark, epic, and unconventional. The battle music also takes a peculiar turn, becoming a collection of chimes and distorted percussive melodies. Do you feel victorious yet? The music that plays in the town of Bistritz is almost pleasant, but there's something about it that betrays a dark secret, as if to say, everybody's smiling, but they shouldn't be. There were a few contributors to the soundtrack outside of Hirota, the first of which being a man who probably needs no introduction on this channel, Yasunori Mitsuda. The tracks in which he contributed are almost immediately noticeable. They're bright, cheerful, with ample use of the flute and fretless bass. They even share similar chord progressions with some of his other timeless tunes. Anyway, there's a lot of variety here. I'm sure everybody who's played Shadow Hearts has their own favorite tracks. In light of Kikuta's departure, and thus the loss of a world-class video game composer, it seems Hirota pulled out all the stops to fill such enormous shoes. It's a much more traditionally structured soundtrack than Koudelka, which is of course because Shadow Hearts is a much more traditionally structured RPG. It stands out among the atmosphere and visual design as one of Shadow Hearts' most unique and memorable aspects. But why the fuck does this song play in England? Turn of the century England wasn't like a giddy, clack your heels together place to be. The average life expectancy was like 9. If you were even allowed to go home after work, you'd gather around the dinner table and eat coal. Like your dinner table's like a barrel or something. Shortly after the party arrives, we're introduced to our final recruitable party member, Hallie. He's sort of a wild card, Oliver Twist type character, but I definitely consider him the most valuable party member aside from Yuri, due to his large roster of spells. I could do without him yelling "I hate you" after every one though. I hate you! I hate you! He's a member of the London Rats, a group of orphans who live in an abandoned building, stealing food and pickpocketing to survive. There's a very creepy segment in which you've got to go to Jack's orphanage. Jack the Ripper, presumably, who's repping that Kiryu drip. One of Hallie's friends has been kidnapped and it's up to us to get her back. The orphanage itself acts as a dungeon, of which there are quite a few in Shadow Hearts. Unlike Nemeton Monastery in Koudelka, which itself is just one big dungeon, there's a clear delineation between safe areas and dungeons in Shadow Hearts. Many of them are run-of-the-mill labyrinths, but there are a few puzzle dungeons that have some decent brain teasers, the orphanage being one of those. Confronting Jack, the party finds that he's been toying with the occult, trying to revive his deceased mother and using Chris as a vessel. Hallie's latent powers come to the forefront as he stops Jack and rescues his friend. The same voice that had been guiding Yuri also communicates with Hallie, a voice he claims is his mother. Speaking of mother, we have to fight Jax, and it's definitely a visual callback to Elaine from Koudelka. This raises questions regarding the connection between Jack's revival method and Patrick's. We learn from Hallie that his mother was condemned to a mental hospital years ago. With Yuri now committed to finding the source of this mysterious voice, the party head to the institution, which reminds me a lot of Helena Prison from Legend of Dragoon. Unlike many games which front-load their best parts, I increasingly found the opposite to be true in Shadow Hearts. The story becomes much more compelling as it moves forward. As the fat is trimmed from earlier segments and some of the lower stakes conflicts are wrapped up, more of a focus is paid to the events that we've been questioning since the beginning. That's especially true if you're a fan of the previous game, as we find out that Hallie's mother is, in fact, Koudelka. The woman, not the game. So talk about a raw deal. After all she's been through in life, Koudelka gives birth to Hallie, likely Edward's child as well. She raises him as a single mother and suddenly gets sent to prison because of her abilities. It seems Roger Bacon was after her power in a similar manner that Dewey was with Alice. Like the opposites of yin and yang, Alice and Koudelka both embody different types of magic. Whatever his plans are, Roger Bacon needs Koudelka for them. She snaps out of a catatonic state and gives herself up in exchange for her son's life. In a moment of lucidity, she tells the party to head to Wales and speak to someone at Nemeton. Times like this are where it pays off to play earlier games in a series. I know it's just some simple plot elements, but it feels exciting to know that fan service is in your immediate future. I do like that Koudelka's back, as I wasn't expecting Shadow Hearts to have so many direct ties to the previous game. But it's also disappointing that she's relegated to such an insignificant role. She's basically lost her entire personality from the previous game, and she's used here as more of a plot device than a developed character. Shortly after, there's a scene where Yuri shows Hallie some tough love. It's one of the most uncomfortable interactions I've seen in a video game. Hallie is understandably upset as he grieves what appears to be his mother's death. Yuri, who was so sad about his parents dying that he literally invented a physical embodiment of punishment over it, calls Hallie a pussy, makes fun of him for crying, and gives him a haymaker right in the fucking face. Yuri, a man who needed Alice to help him so he could work his way out of depression, says, "I don't have time to sit around babysitting weaklings like you." I understand the spirit of the scene. Yuri sees a lot of himself in Hallie. Both were cursed with powers they never asked for, both grew up without their parents, both are guided by voices in their heads. He thinks, I needed someone to snap me out of it, I'll do the same for Hallie. But Christ, Yuri, he's 12 years old. Give him an evening or so to process the loss of his mother, especially after he just thought that he'd saved her. Alice just sits there and watches too. Somebody ask if he's okay, please. Following this, we are given a flashback of Alice with her father just prior to his death. He waits for his associate named Doyle to finish up meeting with one Cardinal Albert Simon, supposedly the only man who can defeat Roger Bacon. Just then, Bacon emerges from the shadows where he would kill Alice's father. But something isn't right here. Alice rushes back to the French town of Rouen to the church where the incident occurred. There she finds a photograph of Hans Doyle and Roger Bacon, the latter of which is identified as Albert Simon. Bacon appears, revealing that he was indeed using a pseudonym. He is Cardinal Albert Simon. Where once he needed Alice, he now has Koudelka, so he reveals his grand plan to the former. While it's somewhat out of character for him to not just kill her, his motivations are more complicated than I had initially thought. He's been watching for many years as the upper class and aristocracy has stamped its boots on the backs of the commoners. Anytime revolution threatens to rear its head, it's stopped by those in power who continue this facsimile of peace and prosperity. Yet Simon doesn't put on any airs regarding his motivation. He simply admits that he seeks revenge. Revenge for hundreds or even thousands of years of oppression. His methods of achieving this are left a mystery as he leaves before any questions can be answered. The party travels to Wales, the cape on which Nemeton Monastery used to stand. The music here is just the perfect blend of mysterious and reflective. You can almost see the events of Koudelka taking place in your mind's eye. James O'Flaherty's grave can be found in the ruins as well, confirming the bad ending of Koudelka is considered canon. It's here at a mysterious observatory that the party meets Roger Bacon. I really did think, for the majority of this game, that they just straight up retconned Roger Bacon's character, so this has been a pretty effective bait and switch. My only complaint is that, like Koudelka, they altered his personality quite a bit. Where once he was completely unpredictable, bordering on crazy, he's now more like a kooky mad scientist who has it together for the most part. Still an entertaining on-screen presence, but less unique. Discussion ensues. It turns out that Albert Simon was Roger Bacon's protege back in the 1200s. Like James, Simon climbed up from the lowest rungs of society in order to join the clergy, but he carried knowledge of society's injustice with him. Bacon would attempt to convince Simon that a world in which all are considered equal was unattainable. Simon tried to destroy his mentor for this, but was ultimately tried and condemned himself. That's when he turned to the occult, using the Emigre document. The party finds him deep underneath the ruined monastery, attempting to summon a god from the far reaches of space-time. His plan is to cleanse the world, a disappointingly simplistic goal for a fairly interesting villain. Koudelka still lives and attempts to stop him, but it's too late. From deep underneath the ocean, a device known as the Float sends out a celestial signal to this outer god. It's a haunting cutscene and beautifully animated for its time as well. I believe this is the 5th time I've reviewed a game where an ancient structure ascends from the bottom of the ocean. What are the odds, right? The castle of Nîmes now floats in the sky, a legacy left behind by ancient beings who once inhabited Earth. I love that Roger Bacon knows that God resides in the M72 Nebula 4,800,000 light years away. How did he figure that out? Well, this man's a genius, so he's even constructed a teleportation device you can use to storm Nîmes. This is all fun in-game history, but if you've played more than a few JRPGs, it's likely all very familiar territory to you. Before you leave for the endgame, there are a few side quests you have available to you, but not many. This is not a particularly exploration-focused game. You're on a linear track for the most part. Even when you can revisit previous locations, they're all deceptively small. Even the city hub areas don't have much to them, which is a real shame. In any case, there's a somewhat cryptic side activity which is required to unlock the good ending. After receiving a certain key item, you have to build Yuri's malice until you start encountering the masks. One by one, they can be defeated, leading to them becoming cracked and inactive in the graveyard. Alice will end up there at one point in the game and be able to enter a previously inaccessible door. Apparently, it's time to pay up for her contract. Her soul must be given in exchange for Yuri's, and so she faces Atman, a spirit represented by a mask covered with eyes. It's probably my favorite enemy design in the game. If you fail to defeat the 4 masks, he'll take Alice's soul, which will affect the game's outcome. Otherwise, Yuri will arrive all cool-like and say, "Your contract sucks," before facing off against Atman. It's certainly not an easy battle, but if you succeed, you'll save both the soul of Yuri and Alice, ensuring you'll get the good ending. Alice will reflect on what she loves about Yuri, despite how different in temperament the two are.
Would you be surprised if I told you that I sometimes wished our journey together would never end?
This isn't what her voice sounds like when she hits people with books. Once you're ready to roll, you'll end up in Nîmes, which is a long and arduous dungeon. It's also got some of the most aesthetically outrageous areas across either game. With sections of the pre-rendered map being animated, it reminds me of a late 90s point-and-click horror game like Sanitarium. This dungeon is quite a long one, and while you can teleport out of it, teleporting back in will always restart you from the beginning, so you better get the items you need before you get here. The enemies are some of the most difficult you'll face as well. You're pushed into using your strongest abilities, resulting in you spending about 80% of your time in Nîmes watching long spell animations. Don't get me wrong, they look great and become quite elaborate by this stage in the game, but they're a bit disruptive to the flow of battle. You really wish for a skip button at a certain point. The enemies are tough enough, but the HP count of some of these bosses is downright ludicrous here. It feels like they're trying to artificially inflate the difficulty in some cases, which is just wholly unnecessary. Mechanically, Nîmes plays like a pretty stereotypical final area for an RPG. There are energy barriers that need to be shut down, the party needs to split up into groups, mazes need to be navigated. It's all there, everything you'd ever want and perhaps not want. They went full tilt on the boss designs here too, just totally otherworldly and perfectly suiting the environment of the area. Also find the boss theme to be quite unsettling too. It almost sounds like a joyous hymn at points, like this is an occasion to be celebrated. Finally, the party confronts and defeats Albert Simon, 5-time champion of the European Wanking League. He decides rather abruptly that humanity isn't so bad and gives you his blessing to go confront the incoming space god. The change of heart after being defeated isn't an uncommon trope, but it feels particularly cheap here to me. It seems like you're meant to empathize with Albert Simon throughout most of the game, seeing as his intentions aren't evil per se. But that's a tall order when you start talking about purging, and this does little to redeem his character in my eyes. The party ends up on a seal in space where they confront their adversary. There's something about Yuri saying, "Alright, God," that gives me a chuckle as well. It's definitely a battle of attrition. Metagod has got a massive health pool and doles out some pretty obnoxious status effects. That's why, if you're like me and hoard all of your items, Shadow Hearts is one of a few games where that really pays off. I'd accrued a good supply of very rare and powerful consumables. Items that let you attack 7 times in a row, items that guarantee critical hits, items that expand your hit area. I used as many of them as I possibly could, and I've never seen such a satisfying damage output in all my days. Metagod is dead, and I have killed him. In the end, Nîmes collapses and things return as they were. Alice reminisces over the events of the game, and we see what happens to each of the characters from the journey. Keith goes back to sleep for an indeterminate period of time. Zhuzhen returns to the ruined Shanghai in order to help rebuild and restore balance. Marguerite goes somewhere to do spy things. Koudelka and Hallie head to America to find Edward. Yuri and Alice become an adorable couple and head to Zurich to meet Alice's mother. If you don't get the good ending, Alice's soul is lost and she never wakes up. Thus, the Book of Shadow Hearts is closed, at least for a time. Shadow Hearts Covenant would release 3 years later in 2004, a fan favorite and a game that frequently tops best of lists when talking about RPGs for the PS2. The team would go on to alter many aspects of the design for Covenant, the game being rendered in real-time 3D with full voice acting and more heavily leaning into the humor and personality introduced in Shadow Hearts. This game then stands alone as a metamorphic state for the series. For the first game in the first series of a brand new studio, Koudelka is the product of vision. Kikuta had dreamed for years of developing his own creative product, and when it came time to put his money where his mouth was, he really put his best foot forward. If Koudelka was a golden child with pinchable cheeks and full of potential, Shadow Hearts feels like its awkward, voice-cracking adolescence, unsure of how to proceed without the guidance of its father. In some ways, it's more intelligent and ambitious than its predecessor. Rather than crafting a narrative around a simple and digestible plot, its interests are far more worldly. Mixing Lovecraftian horror with history, anthology, spy adventure, science fiction, religious mythology, and war stories, it really does feel like the sky's the limit for Shadow Hearts. Sadly, those disparate elements are not always successfully brought together into a cohesive package. By the time it feels like Shadow Hearts has comfortably found an identity, there's only a few hours of game left to play. Saknoth's distancing of Shadow Hearts from Koudelka may have been a point of contention within the team, but it may also have been necessary. After Koudelka failed to attract attention, going back to the drawing board and appealing to a broader audience may have been what saved the studio in the end, at least in the short term. Abiding by a more typical RPG structure in its story and battle system was perhaps freeing in its restrictiveness. This allowed a fresh-faced team to find their voice in its themes and characters, of which there's so much going on, it's hard to parse the wheat from the chaff. In some sense, this is a failure on Shadow Hearts' part, especially given the clear and direct messages of meaning and redemption present in Koudelka. On the other hand, this is part of what makes Shadow Hearts such a memorable and weird experience. Maybe reining in all of that stuff would have resulted in something forgettable. Maybe it needed to walk around aimlessly so that Covenant could run. I can't say for sure. Recently, a spiritual successor to the Shadow Hearts series called Penny Blood has been successfully funded on Kickstarter. If all goes according to plan, there will undoubtedly be a lot of people interested in the series, wondering if it's worth returning to these games. My opinion on Shadow Hearts, in a word, is it's fine. It's the embodiment of fine as far as RPGs go. There's a handful of interesting characters, a turn-based battle system adds a few flourishes to make it interesting, the pre-rendered backgrounds are great, and so is the music. Many of the characters are underdeveloped, the story often fails to assert the appropriate stakes, and the pacing is just wonky, only finding its rhythm in the latter half. I wouldn't recommend this game to just anyone, only big fans of turn-based RPGs that also love horror. I have no qualms saying that in most ways it's a better game than Koudelka, but as a holistic experience, it just doesn't match its predecessor. I've fallen in love with Koudelka since I first played it, this being my third time, and I have no doubt I'll find more to love about it as the years go by. It's a beautiful work of art, something grounded and human, surprisingly so, given the time in which it was made. Shadow Hearts is a good start, but I guess I was hoping for a good middle. Perhaps I'll find that in Covenant. Until then, don't be a pessimistic Chad. Be a cat lady. Thank you for watching. I'd like to say a big thank you to my patrons, whose patron questions I will now answer. I would say the biggest lesson I've learned is that it's okay to step out of your wheelhouse. I would say that I'm looking forward to getting creative and making some more kind of weird stuff in between the retrospectives. I've had a beard ever since I could grow one. I've got blonde hair, so it was pure neckbeard action for a period of time. I didn't know better. But I don't do anything particular to take care of it. I just condition it reasonably often and trim it once a week or so. It's, just hair. Just treat it like hair. I rarely play a game through if I'm not enjoying it, especially if it's a longer one. But I would have to say that it took me a few tries into Planescape Torment before I really liked that game. After marinating in it for a while though, I really do love that game. I don't watch a ton of TV, but in terms of drama, I love Breaking Bad, Better Call Saul. I have pretty basic taste, I guess. For comedy though, I've rewatched Kenny vs. Spenny, Nathan For You, and Arrested Development more times than I can count, because I just love awkward humor, much to my girlfriend's chagrin. It's tough to say better, but I would say that The Witcher 3's DLCs are in many ways as good as the game. Hearts of Stone in particular, I found the plot for that to be more gripping than the base game. Not necessarily an answer to the question, but I don't think I could play through Bloodborne without the old hunters at this point. I just need that pizza cutter. I'd also like to say a special thank you to those in my Persons of Lordly Caliber patron tier. Adam Safranco, Matthew Sean Dick, Banana Turnip, Sleepy, Avil, and Hime Takamura, thank you both. True Manalist, Scatmouth, Spencer Kennelly, I'm Emil Castagne's #1 fan, Captain, BB Squirrel, Shane Shack, Mr. Shifty, Buster Drew, Francois, Fanar, Fenrir Lives, Silvar, Olo Shadow, Guko, Jordan Laughlin, Eldon Rosen, Jordan Miller, Hayden Hudson, Rocket Man, Jay Hoon, Azure Midsummer, Destrega, Tepid Tag Tournament, F, James Adair, Sable Dragon Rock, Cameron himself, Pig Summoner, Idlehander, and Kelly Slaughter. One breath. I did it all in one breath. I appreciate all of you ever so much, even if the I'll read your name aloud at the end of the credits tier is becoming unintentional comedy. If you're interested in supporting me, please consider checking out my Patreon and net some nifty rewards while you're at it. To everybody else, till I see you next time, stay healthy, wealthy, and wise.